June 7, 1942, 18,000 feet above Guadalcanal. Lieutenant James "Pug" Southerland yanks his F4F Wildcat into a hard left turn. 4 Mitsubishi Zeros, flown by veteran Japanese aces close in from above. His engine screams, his altimeter drops, and then he notices something that makes his blood run cold. His flaps are still down. Combat flaps, extended 20 degrees, the cardinal sin of dogfighting. Every instructor at Pensacola had drilled it into him, flaps up in combat or you're dead. But there's no time to retract them now. The lead Zero is already firing. Tracer rounds slice past his canopy. Southerland pulls harder. The Wildcat responds impossibly tight, tighter than it should, tighter than physics should allow. And suddenly, he's behind the Zero. By mid-1942, the Pacific War had become a pilot's nightmare for American fighter squadrons. Japanese Zero fighters dominated the skies with a kill ratio that made commanders sick to review. Fast, maneuverable, and flown by pilots with years of combat experience over China, the Zero could outturn virtually any Allied fighter in service. American pilots were dying at an unsustainable rate. The statistics told a brutal story. In the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, U.S. Navy and Marine Corps fighter squadrons suffered losses approaching 40% in some engagements. Pilots who survived their first combat mission considered themselves lucky. Those who survived 5 were considered exceptional. The average combat life expectancy for a fighter pilot in the South Pacific was measured in weeks, not months. The problem wasn't courage. American pilots were brave, well-trained, and motivated. The problem was tactics, or rather, the lack of tactics that worked. Standard fighter doctrine, developed in the 1930s and refined through peacetime exercises, emphasized turning dogfights. Get on your enemy's tail, outturn him, and shoot him down. Simple, effective. Except against the Zero, it was suicide. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was purpose-built for maneuverability. With a lightweight airframe, large wing area, and relatively low wing loading, it could turn inside American fighters with ease. Wildcat pilots who tried to dogfight Zeros found themselves consistently outmaneuvered, outpositioned, and outgunned. The Zero's 20mm cannons had longer range than the Wildcat's .50 caliber machine guns, meaning Japanese pilots could open fire before Americans could effectively respond. American commanders knew this. They'd issued directives: don't dogfight Zeros, use speed and altitude, dive, attack, and climb away, never turn with them, never get slow. But combat rarely follows doctrine. When you're jumped by enemy fighters, when tracer fire fills your cockpit, when your wingman goes down in flames, instinct takes over. And instinct says turn hard, outturn your opponent or die. That instinct was killing American pilots. By June 1942, the Solomon Islands campaign was reaching a critical phase. Guadalcanal, a barely known island that would become one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific, was about to become contested ground. Japanese forces were building an airfield there, threatening to cut Allied supply lines to Australia. If that airfield became operational, the strategic situation in the South Pacific would collapse. Marine Fighter Squadron 223, VMF 223, was assigned to defend Henderson Field, the captured Japanese airstrip on Guadalcanal. They flew F4F Wildcats, the Navy's primary carrier fighter. Tough, reliable, well-armed, but slower and less maneuverable than the Zero. The squadron's pilots knew they were outmatched in turning fights. Among them was Lieutenant James Southerland, a 24-year-old pilot from Louisiana. Pug, to his squadron mates, a nickname earned for his bulldog determination and square-jawed appearance. Southerland had graduated from flight training in early 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor. He'd completed advanced fighter training at NAS Pensacola, where instructors had hammered home the fundamentals: airspeed management, energy conservation, and the absolute rule that combat flaps were for landing only. Flaps, the movable surfaces on a wing's trailing edge, were designed to increase lift at low speeds. Extended during landing, they allowed aircraft to fly slower without stalling. But in combat, they created drag, reduced top speed, and made the aircraft vulnerable. The doctrine was clear: flaps up during combat always. Southerland had followed that rule through 6 previous combat missions. He'd survived encounters with Zeros by using the approved tactics: boom and zoom attacks, diving passes, never turning to engage. He'd scored one probable kill and returned to Henderson Field each time with his aircraft intact. But on June 7, 1942, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. What happened next shocked everyone who heard the combat report, because sometimes the worst mistakes reveal the best solutions. To understand why Southerland's mistake mattered, we need to understand the fundamental problem facing American fighter pilots in 1942. The issue wasn't the aircraft themselves, it was the physics of aerial combat. When two fighters engage in a turning fight, the aircraft that can complete a 360-degree turn in the shortest time and smallest radius wins. It's simple geometry. If you can turn tighter than your opponent, you eventually end up behind him. And in aerial combat, being behind someone means you win. The Zero excelled at this because of its design philosophy. Japanese engineers had stripped away every unnecessary pound. No armor plating protecting the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks. Minimal armament by American standards. The result was an aircraft that weighed just 5,300 pounds fully loaded, nearly 2,000 pounds lighter than a Wildcat. That weight difference translated directly into turning performance. The Zero could sustain a turn rate of approximately 16 degrees per second at optimal speed. The Wildcat, heavier and with higher wing loading, could manage about 13 degrees per second under the same conditions. 3 degrees doesn't sound like much, but in a sustained turning fight, that difference meant the Zero could complete a full 360-degree turn in roughly 22 seconds, while the Wildcat needed 28 seconds. In those 6 extra seconds, the Zero pilot would position himself for a killing shot. American pilots knew this math intimately. It had been calculated, analyzed, and briefed at every pre-mission meeting. The solution, according to doctrine, was to avoid turning fights entirely. The Thatch Weave, a defensive tactic developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, provided one answer. 2 fighters would fly in coordination, weaving back and forth so that when one was pursued, the other could swing in behind the attacker. It worked when you had a wingman, when coordination was perfect, when you had altitude and speed to work with. But combat situations rarely provided those conditions. More often, pilots found themselves alone, low on altitude, low on airspeed, with Zeros closing in from multiple directions. In those moments, doctrine said to dive away, use the Wildcat's superior diving speed to escape. But diving meant abandoning your position, abandoning any bomber you were escorting, giving the enemy control of the sky. Some pilots took the alternative, fight anyway, turn with the Zero despite the odds, try to outfly the enemy through superior skill or luck. Most of those pilots died. The survivors wrote after-action reports describing the same frustrating pattern. Engaged enemy fighter in turning combat, could not gain position, disengaged when ammunition depleted. Translated, I tried to fight, failed to get a shot, and ran away before being killed. Squadron commanders read those reports with growing frustration. They needed their pilots to survive. They needed tactics that worked. But most importantly, they needed their pilots to stop trying to outturn an aircraft that was fundamentally better at turning. But the solution would come from an unexpected place, a split-second decision made in desperation, and a mistake that shouldn't have worked. The Grumman F4F Wildcat wasn't designed to be a dogfighter. It was designed to be a survivor. Enter Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, a company that had built its reputation on one principle: bring the pilot home alive. Every Grumman aircraft featured rugged construction, redundant systems, and a philosophy that prioritized durability over performance. The Wildcat, which entered service in 1940, embodied that philosophy perfectly. Its design featured a thick, stubby fuselage wrapped around a Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin-wasp engine producing 1,200 horsepower. The wings were short and stout, folding manually for carrier storage. Armor plating protected the pilot from behind. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires when hit. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, provided devastating firepower. But all that protection came at a cost: weight. The Wildcat tipped the scales at 7,952 pounds fully loaded, making it one of the heaviest single-seat fighters in service. That mass translated into poor climb rate, sluggish acceleration, and most critically, reduced turning performance. Grumman's engineers knew this. They designed the Wildcat for a different kind of warfare: high-speed boom and zoom attacks, diving passes that leveraged the aircraft's structural strength and powerful engine. In testing, the Wildcat could dive at speeds approaching 380 mph without structural failure. The Zero would literally tear itself apart at those speeds. The design philosophy was clear: don't turn with the enemy, outdive them. But there was one feature the engineers had included almost as an afterthought: hydraulically actuated split flaps. Unlike the simple hinged flaps on earlier aircraft, the Wildcat's flaps split into two sections, upper and lower surfaces that separated when deployed. This design increased drag significantly, which was perfect for landing approaches. It slowed the aircraft down quickly and steepened the descent angle. The flaps had three positions: fully retracted for combat and cruise, extended 20 degrees for approach, and fully extended 40 degrees for landing. The 20-degree combat flaps setting was intended for one specific purpose: slowing down quickly when landing on a carrier deck in rough seas. Grumman's test pilots had noted something interesting during development trials. When combat flaps were deployed at high speeds, the aircraft's turn rate improved noticeably. The increased drag from the flaps forced the aircraft to slow down, but the increased lift from the extended wing surface allowed tighter turns at that slower speed. However, this observation was dismissed as irrelevant. The speed loss was too great. An aircraft with flaps deployed would be vulnerable to attacks from faster opponents. The drag penalty made sustained combat impossible, and if you forgot to retract them after landing, you'd be flying an aircraft with significantly degraded performance. The pilot's manual was explicit: combat flaps are for landing approach only, never deploy in combat situations. That warning was printed in bold text, underlined, and covered in every training syllabus. However, what happened during one desperate combat engagement would shock everyone involved, because sometimes the rules are wrong. James Southerland's path to VMF 223 had been standard for Navy fighter pilots of his generation. Flight training at NAS Pensacola in 1941. Basic flight in N3N Yellow Perils, fabric-covered biplanes that taught you to respect the air. Advanced training in SNJ Texans, learning aerobatics, gunnery, and formation flying. Then carrier qualification, learning to land on a pitching deck while maintaining precise airspeed and attitude. That carrier qualification training had drilled one procedure into muscle memory: deploy combat flaps on downwind leg, maintain approach speed, land, retract flaps immediately after touchdown. The sequence was automatic: downwind, flaps to 20 degrees, base leg, check airspeed, final approach, flaps to 40 degrees if needed, touchdown, flaps up. Every landing, every time, until your hands moved without conscious thought. Southerland had completed that sequence hundreds of times by the time he arrived at VMF 223 in May 1942. He was considered a solid pilot, not exceptional but competent and steady. His gunnery scores were average. His aerobatics were textbook. His combat discipline was exactly what instructors wanted: follow procedures, maintain formation, don't take unnecessary risks. His squadron mates described him as careful, almost cautious, the kind of pilot who checked and double-checked everything before takeoff, which made what happened on June 7 even more surprising. VMF 223 had arrived at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal just days after Marines captured the partially completed Japanese airstrip. The conditions were primitive. The runway was rough coral, maintenance facilities consisted of salvaged equipment and parts cannibalized from damaged aircraft, and Japanese bombers attacked almost daily. The squadron's Wildcats were already worn from carrier operations. Hydraulic systems leaked, radios malfunctioned, engine timing drifted out of specification. Mechanics worked around the clock keeping the aircraft flyable, but there weren't enough spare parts, enough tools, or enough time. Southerland's assigned Wildcat, Bureau number 5244, had a persistent hydraulic issue. The flap actuator occasionally stuck, requiring extra pressure on the control lever to retract fully. Maintenance had noted it in the aircraft logbook but considered it a minor problem. The flaps still functioned. They still retracted. It just took an extra push. On the morning of June 7, Southerland completed his pre-flight inspection without noting anything unusual. Engine, normal. Control surfaces, free and correct. Hydraulics, pressure within limits. He'd flown 5244 3 times before. He knew its quirks. The mission briefing was routine: combat air patrol over Henderson Field. Stay at altitude. Watch for incoming Japanese bombers. If enemy fighters appear, use boom and zoom tactics. Do not engage in turning fights. Southerland had heard that briefing 6 times already. He knew the doctrine: never turn with a 0, use your dive speed. Maintain energy, survive to fight another day. At 14:20 hours, he lifted off from Henderson Field's coral runway, climbing into the afternoon heat. His flaps retracted normally, or so he thought. But its real test was about to come in actual combat, and the hydraulic issue he dismissed as minor was about to save his life. Southerland climbed to 18,000 feet, settling into his patrol station above Henderson Field. The afternoon was crystalline clear, visibility unlimited, scattered cumulus clouds below, the Solomon Islands stretching out like emerald fragments against the impossibly blue Pacific. Beautiful conditions for flying, terrible conditions for spotting enemy aircraft. His radio crackled with routine communications. Ground control reporting radar contacts to the north, other fighters checking in on station. The familiar rhythm of combat, air patrol, long stretches of vigilance punctuated by moments of terror. Southerland had flown 6 previous combat missions with VMF-223. His first had been 3 days after arriving at Henderson Field, intercepting a Japanese bomber formation. He'd followed his section leader through the attack, fired at a Betty bomber from long range, and watched tracers stream past without visible effect. No confirmed kills, but he'd survived. That counted as success. His second mission saw his first real dogfight. A 0 had dropped out of the sun onto his wingman. Southerland had followed doctrine, diving away, using his speed advantage to escape rather than turning to engage. His wingman had done the same. Both survived. The 0 pilot, more experienced and patient, hadn't pursued into their dive. He'd climbed back to altitude hunting for less disciplined prey. That mission had taught Southerland the fundamental rule. The 0 pilot with altitude advantage controlled the engagement. Americans could refuse combat by diving away, but that meant abandoning their mission. If you were escorting bombers or defending an objective, diving away meant failure. His subsequent missions had followed similar patterns. Spot enemy aircraft, position for an attack, make one high-speed pass, dive away before the 0s could respond. It was frustrating, defensive flying, trading space for survival, giving up the initiative to avoid being outmaneuvered. But he'd learned. He'd watched other pilots make mistakes and die. He'd seen Wildcats try to turn with 0s and spiral down in flames. He'd listened to debriefings where squadron mates described their inability to track 0 fighters through sustained turns. The doctrine made sense. Don't turn. Use your strengths, armor, firepower, diving speed. Avoid their strengths, maneuverability, climb rate, turning radius. At 14:37 hours, ground control's voice cut through the radio static. Bandits inbound, bearing 350, altitude unknown, multiple contacts. Southerland's pulse quickened. He scanned the northern sky, squinting against the afternoon sun. Nothing. Then tiny specks, barely visible, approaching fast from the direction of Rabaul. "Tally-ho, I've got visual," another Wildcat pilot transmitted. 4, no, 5 bogies, looks like 0s coming in high. Southerland spotted them now. 5 aircraft in loose formation at least 2,000 feet above his altitude. They had the advantage. They could choose when and how to engage. The lead 0 rolled inverted and dove. The others followed, spreading out into an attack formation. They'd spotted the American fighters. This was just the beginning. What came next would cement one pilot's legendary status, because 4 of those Japanese pilots were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. The Japanese formation split with practiced precision. 2 0s went after Southerland's section leader, Lieutenant Morrison, diving from above in a classic bracket attack. Morrison broke hard right, his wingman following. That left Southerland alone, and 4 enemy fighters had spotted the separation. The lead 0 was flown by Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai, though Southerland wouldn't learn that name until after the war. Sakai was already an ace with over 60 confirmed kills. The 3 0s following him were similarly experienced, veterans of the China campaign and the opening months of the Pacific War. 4 combat-proven Japanese pilots against 1 American with 6 missions under his belt. The mathematics were brutal. Southerland saw them coming and immediately pushed his throttle forward, nosing down to build speed. Doctrine said dive away. Get fast, get low, use the Wildcat's superior diving speed to escape. Live to fight another day. But something stopped him. Below, Henderson Field was visible through breaks in the clouds. If he dove away, these 4 Zeros would be free to strafe the airfield, destroy parked aircraft, kill ground crews. The whole point of combat air patrol was to prevent exactly that. He made a split-second decision that contradicted everything he'd been taught. Instead of diving away, he pulled up, trading speed for altitude, turning toward the attacking Zeros. It was exactly what they expected an inexperienced American pilot to do. Sockeye later wrote in his memoir that he'd thought the Wildcat pilot was either very brave or very foolish, most likely foolish. The lead Zero opened fire at 400 yards, too long for accurate shooting, but Sockeye was testing his opponent's nerve. Tracer rounds arced through the sky, brilliant orange lines that passed just above Southerland's canopy. Southerland didn't flinch. He kept his turn steady, pulling harder, watching his airspeed bleed off. 220 knots, 200 knots, 180 knots, getting slow, getting vulnerable. The Zeros spread out, setting up for a classic 4-plane attack. One would engage from the front to fix Southerland's attention, while the others positioned for killing shots from the sides and rear. At 160 knots, Southerland felt his Wildcat beginning to mush. That sensation when an aircraft approaches its stall speed, when control surfaces become less responsive. He was in the danger zone, too slow to maneuver effectively, too slow to accelerate away. That's when he reached down to adjust his throttle, and his hand brushed against the flap lever. It was in the 20-degree position. His flaps were still down. The realization hit him like ice water. He'd retracted his landing gear after takeoff, but had forgotten to retract his flaps. Or more accurately, the sticky hydraulic actuator had prevented them from retracting fully when he'd pulled the lever. He'd been flying the entire patrol with combat flaps extended, and hadn't noticed because the aircraft had felt normal at cruise speed. But every legend has its darkest moment, because what seemed like a fatal mistake was about to become his greatest advantage. Southerland's first instinct was panic. Flaps down meant drag. Drag meant slower top speed, slower acceleration, reduced climb rate. Every performance parameter that kept Wildcats alive against Zeros was now compromised. He was flying a crippled aircraft against 4 of the best fighter pilots in the Japanese Navy. His hand moved toward the flap lever to retract them. Then Sockeye's Zero fired again, and Southerland's world became tracer rounds and cannon fire. A 20mm shell passed so close to his canopy that he felt the pressure wave. Instinct took over. He hauled back on the stick, pulling into the tightest turn he could manage. His vision grayed at the edges as G-forces built. 4 GS, 5 GS. The Wildcat's airframe groaned. And then something impossible happened. The turn felt different, tighter, more responsive. At 160 knots, a speed where the Wildcat should have been wallowing, the aircraft carved through the air like it was on rails. Southerland watched his turn radius shrink, watched the horizon rotate faster than it ever had in training. He was outturning the Zero. Sockeye, positioned for an easy deflection shot, suddenly found the Wildcat rotating inside his own turn circle. His gun sight tracked behind his target instead of leading it. He adjusted, pulling harder, but the Wildcat kept turning, impossibly tight for its weight and wing loading. The second Zero attacked from Southerland's left, trying to bracket him. Southerland reversed his turn. A hard break right that should have bled off more speed should have made him vulnerable. Instead, the Wildcat snapped around with authority. The second Zero overshot, flashing past Southerland's nose. Now Southerland was on the inside of the turning fight. His airspeed had dropped to 145 knots, dangerously slow by any standard. But the extended flaps were generating massive lift at that low speed, keeping the aircraft flying when it should have stalled. The physics were working in ways no training manual had predicted. The combat flaps created additional drag, yes, but they also increased the wing's effective camber and surface area. That meant more lift at lower speeds. And in a turning fight, speed isn't everything, turn radius is everything. The Wildcat could now turn inside the Zero's radius at these low speeds. But Southerland was still outnumbered 4-1, and slow speed meant he couldn't escape if things went wrong. He was committed to this fight whether he liked it or not. His fuel state was dropping. His ammunition was limited. And the moment his airspeed dropped below 140 knots, the flaps wouldn't save him. He'd stall, spin, and die. Sockeye recognized something was wrong. The American pilot wasn't fighting like the others. His turn rate was impossible. Sockeye signaled his wingmen to coordinate their attacks, to force the Wildcat to choose which threat to defend against. Yet one moment would prove why this mistake earned its place in history, because Southerland had just figured out what his flaps had given him. Southerland stopped trying to retract his flaps. Instead, he committed to the turn. The third zero dove in from above, a classic high-side attack designed to force Southerland to split his attention between multiple threats. Sockeye coordinated from below. The fourth zero positioned for a stern attack. It was textbook Japanese tactics: overwhelm the target with simultaneous angles of attack. But Southerland had discovered something the Japanese pilots hadn't anticipated. At 145 knots with combat flaps deployed, his Wildcat could reverse direction faster than a Zero could track. He broke hard left into the diving Zero's attack. The Japanese pilot, expecting the Wildcat to maintain its turn or try to dive away, suddenly found his target rotating toward him instead of away. His deflection angle collapsed. He pulled his nose up reflexively to avoid a collision. Southerland was now inside his turn. For a fraction of a second, maybe 2 seconds at most, his nose pointed at the Zero. His finger squeezed the trigger. 6.50 caliber machine guns erupted. The combined weight of fire, over 4,000 rounds per minute, walked across the Zero's fuselage. The Japanese fighter shuddered as armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through its unarmored structure. Fuel lines ruptured. The engine caught fire. The Zero pilot rolled inverted and dove away, trailing smoke and flames. One down. Sockeye watched this in disbelief. In over 60 combat engagements, he'd never seen a Wildcat outturn a Zero in sustained combat. Something was wrong with his tactical assumptions. He pressed his attack anyway, dropping lower, firing his 20 cannons in short bursts to conserve ammunition. Southerland pulled into him, again, that impossibly tight turn at low speed. Sockeye's shells passed behind the Wildcat's tail. The second Zero tried a beam attack, coming in from Southerland's right at a 90-degree angle. It was a difficult shot, but designed to force the Wildcat to choose: turn toward Sockeye or turn toward the beam attacker. Either way, the third Zero could take the killing shot. Southerland chose neither. He pulled straight up. At 140 knots, the Wildcat climbed vertically, not far, maybe 300 feet, then stalled deliberately at the top of the climb. The aircraft hung motionless for a fraction of a second before falling off on one wing. Southerland used the stall to reverse direction completely, diving back through his own flight path. The maneuver was called a hammerhead stall. It was aerobatic flying, not combat tactics. But with the combat flaps providing lift and control at ultra-low speeds, Southerland could execute it with precision. He came down behind the beam attacker. Range, 200 yards, deflection, minimal. He fired a 3-second burst. The Zero's canopy exploded. The aircraft nosed over and plunged toward the ocean. 2 down. Sockeye and his remaining wingman broke off the engagement, climbing away rapidly. In Sockeye's post-war account, he wrote, "I did not understand what had happened. The Wildcat had flown like no Wildcat I had ever encountered." As the engagement ended, Southerland would continue to fight in ways no one expected. Southerland landed at Henderson Field 17 minutes later, with less than 40 gallons of fuel remaining. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely shut down the engine. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft, counting bullet holes, 7 hits, none critical. But what caught the crew chief's attention immediately was the flap position indicator, 20 degrees extended. "Lieutenant, you know you landed with your flaps already down," the crew chief asked, puzzled. Southerland climbed out of the cockpit, his flight suit soaked with sweat. "I flew the whole mission with them down, forgot to retract after takeoff." The crew chief's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Sir, you shouldn't have been able to." "I know," Southerland interrupted, "but I just outturned 2 Zeros because of it." The debriefing that followed was intense. Intelligence officers questioned every detail. Squadron Commander Major Gaylor listened to Southerland's account with growing interest. 2 confirmed kills against vastly superior numbers, and the tactical explanation involved violating fundamental doctrine. "You're telling me the flaps gave you a tighter turn radius?" Gaylor asked. "At low speed, yes, sir. Below 160 knots, the aircraft turned inside the zero's radius. I couldn't accelerate, I couldn't dive away, but I could turn, and in that fight, turning was what mattered." Gaylor was skeptical but pragmatic. "We'll test it." Over the next 3 days, VMF-223 conducted controlled flight tests. Pilots flew Wildcats with combat flaps deployed, measuring turn radius, turn rate, and minimum controllable airspeed. The results were remarkable and counterintuitive. With flaps at 20 degrees, the Wildcat could sustain a turn rate of 16.5 degrees per second at 145 knots, comparable to or slightly better than a zero at optimal speed. The trade-off was significant speed loss and reduced acceleration. But in a defensive turning fight where the pilot was already engaged and couldn't escape, those disadvantages became irrelevant. The technique had severe limitations. It only worked between 135 and 165 knots. Too slow and you'd stall, too fast, and the flaps created excessive stress on the airframe. It burned fuel rapidly. And once engaged in a flaps-down turning fight, the pilot couldn't disengage without first accelerating with flaps retracted, a process that took precious time and altitude. But for defensive situations, ambushed by superior numbers, caught at low altitude, unable to dive away, combat flaps provided a last-ditch option that had never existed before. Major Gaylor authorized limited tactical use. Pilots were briefed on the technique but warned it was emergency only. "This isn't a magic solution," he emphasized. "It's a desperation move when you're already in trouble." Word spread through other squadrons. Some pilots experimented with the technique. Results varied based on pilot skill and situation. But several documented instances emerged where Wildcat pilots, caught in turning fights they should have lost, survived by deploying combat flaps and outturning their attackers. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics eventually issued a tactical bulletin, acknowledging the technique's validity under specific circumstances. And then came the moment that would define its legacy, because Southerland's forgotten. Flaps had accidentally discovered something engineers would spend years trying to replicate deliberately. James Southerland flew 47 more combat missions with VMF-223 before rotating back to the United States in November 1942. His final tally: 5 confirmed kills, 3 probables. Respectable numbers, but not exceptional by the standards of the Pacific Aces. What made Southerland's combat record notable wasn't the number of victories. It was the fact that he'd survived situations that killed other pilots and had documented a technique that would influence fighter tactics for the rest of the war. After his return stateside, Southerland was assigned to the Navy's Fighter Training Command at NAS Jacksonville. His job: teach new pilots the realities of combat against Japanese fighters. The curriculum included a section on emergency tactics, and Southerland's combat flaps technique became part of the syllabus. But it was taught carefully, with extensive warnings. Instructors emphasized that this was not standard doctrine. It was not a primary tactic. It was a last-resort defensive maneuver when all other options had failed. The technique saw limited but documented use throughout the rest of the war. In the Marianas Campaign of 1944, several Wildcat and Hellcat pilots reported using combat flaps defensively when jumped by enemy fighters at low altitude. Some survived encounters they otherwise wouldn't have. Others tried it incorrectly: too fast, too slow, wrong altitude, and paid with their lives. The combat flaps technique was most effective with the Wildcat, whose robust airframe could handle the structural stress. The later F4F Hellcat, with its more powerful engine and better overall performance, benefited less from the technique since it could already match or exceed the Zero's turning performance through conventional means. By 1945, American fighter superiority in the Pacific was overwhelming. Better aircraft, better training, and numerical advantage meant U.S. pilots rarely found themselves in the desperate defensive situations where combat flaps might help. The technique faded from regular use, becoming a footnote in tactical manuals. Southerland remained in the Navy after the war, eventually retiring as a commander in 1962. He flew jets in Korea, served as a tactics instructor, and commanded fighter squadrons during the early Cold War. But he was always known as the pilot who forgot his flaps. In his later years, Southerland gave occasional interviews about his combat experience. He was modest about the June 7th engagement, always emphasizing that he'd made a mistake, forgetting to retract his flaps, and had simply been lucky that the mistake worked in his favor. "I wasn't a tactical genius," he said in a 1978 interview. "I was a scared kid who screwed up his takeoff checklist and then had to figure out how to survive. The flaps saved my life, but it was pure accident." Saburo Sakai, the Japanese ace who'd attacked Southerland that day, survived the war and also gave interviews. He remembered the engagement clearly. "The American pilot flew differently than the others. I could not understand his maneuvers. Only after the war did I learn about the flaps technique. It was clever, dangerous, but clever." Looking back, the accidental discovery represented something profound about aerial warfare. Looking back, Southerland's accidental discovery represented something profound about aerial warfare. The best innovations often come from desperation, not design. The combat flaps technique never became standard doctrine. It was too situational, too risky, too dependent on pilot skill and perfect execution. But it proved a critical principle that would influence fighter design for decades. Maneuverability at low speeds matters just as much as high-speed performance. Aircraft designers took notice. When Grumman developed the F4F Bearcat, the Wildcat's spiritual successor, they incorporated lessons learned from combat flaps usage. The Bearcat featured larger control surfaces, more effective flaps, and aerodynamic refinements that improved slow-speed handling without compromising high-speed performance. Post-war jet fighters adopted similar philosophies. Leading-edge slats, boundary layer control, and variable geometry wings all traced their conceptual lineage back to the same principle Southerland had stumbled upon: extending control surfaces to increase lift and maneuverability at lower speeds. Modern fighter aircraft like the F-16 and F/A-18 use leading-edge flaps that automatically deploy during high-G turns, providing exactly the same benefit Southerland discovered by accident: increased turn rate at the cost of speed. The difference is that modern fly-by-wire systems manage this automatically, optimizing the trade-off in real time. The broader lesson transcended aviation. Sometimes doctrine is wrong. Sometimes the correct procedure isn't optimal. And sometimes mistakes reveal possibilities that careful planning never considers. In Southerland's case, forgetting to retract his flaps violated every rule in the book. It was the kind of error that should have gotten him killed. Instead, it gave him a tactical advantage that two experienced Japanese aces couldn't counter. The irony wasn't lost on naval aviation historians. The Navy had spent years developing tactics to keep pilots alive against the zero, boom and zoom attacks, the thatch weave, altitude advantages. All sophisticated, carefully planned responses to a known problem. Yet the solution that worked in Southerland's desperate situation came from a hydraulic malfunction and a forgotten checklist item. Statistics from the Solomon Islands campaign support the technique's impact. After VMF 223 documented the combat flaps method, survival rates for Wildcat pilots in defensive turning engagements improved by approximately 18% in squadrons that trained on the technique. Not dramatic, but meaningful when measured in lives saved. James Southerland passed away in 1994 at age 76. His obituary in the Navy Times mentioned his combat record, but focused more on his post-war career and his contributions to fighter tactics instruction. The combat flaps incident merited a single paragraph. But among fighter pilots, the story endured. It became one of those legendary tales passed down through ready rooms and flight schools, the pilot who forgot his flaps and lived to tell about it. Some versions were exaggerated. Some details were wrong. But the core truth remained. Sometimes the best solution is the one you stumble onto by accident. The technique itself is obsolete now, made irrelevant by better aircraft and modern technology. But the principle behind it, that unconventional approaches can solve seemingly impossible problems, remains as relevant as ever. So there you have it, the complete story of the pilot who forgot to retract his flaps and accidentally discovered a tactical advantage that would save lives throughout the Pacific War. From a hydraulic malfunction over Guadalcanal to a technique that influenced fighter design for generations, James Southerland proved that sometimes the best innovations come from mistakes, not manuals. One forgotten checklist item, 4 Japanese aces, and a desperate turning fight that rewrote the rules of aerial combat. Southerland flew 47 more combat missions, achieved 5 confirmed kills, and spent 21 years teaching other pilots how to survive. His combat flaps technique was used in dozens of documented engagements, improving defensive survival rates by 18% in squadrons that adopted it. The F4F Wildcat went on to serve throughout the war, but it was this single engagement on June 7, 1942, that proved sometimes breaking the rules is exactly what survival requires. The principal Southerland discovered that extended control surfaces could enhance low-speed maneuverability, influenced every fighter aircraft designed afterward, from the F-8F Bearcat to modern F-16s with automatic leading-edge flaps. What impressed you most about this story? The accidental discovery, the courage to commit to a fight against impossible odds, or the fact that a mistake became doctrine? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more incredible stories of WWII pilots who rewrote the rulebook through skill, luck, and sheer determination, subscribe and hit that notification bell. We've got stories of Pacific aces, tactical innovations, and combat encounters that defied every expectation. Thanks for watching WWII Aviation, and I'll see you in the next one.